Let me ask you something before we even begin. Think about the last time you walked into your garage, a storage shed, maybe an old basement, just to grab something you had not touched in months. Maybe it was holiday decorations, maybe old tools, maybe a dusty box you kept telling yourself you would organize someday. You stepped inside, moved a few things around, maybe noticed a little dust in the air, maybe some droppings in a corner you barely paid attention to. Then you walked back out and forgot about it completely. But here is the part nobody tells you. In that ordinary 5-minute visit, you may have already encountered one of the quietest and most dangerous pathogens in North America. No bite, no scratch, no direct contact with an animal, just breathing. And really, that is what makes Hantavirus different from almost every other virus people have been warned about in recent years. Today we are breaking this down completely, accurately, calmly, without the panic-driven headlines flooding the news this week. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what Hantavirus is, how it enters the human body, what it actually does once inside, why adults over 60 carry very specific risks most mainstream coverage ignores, and what practical steps you can take immediately to protect yourself and the people around you. But before we go further, there is one concept I need you to remember. The quiet window problem. Honestly, it may be the single most important thing about this virus, and almost nobody is explaining it properly. Hold that phrase in your mind because everything we discuss today builds toward it. Once you understand it, your entire perception of exposure risk changes. Now let us ground this conversation in biology, not headlines. One of the biggest problems in the current news cycle is that the term hantavirus is being treated like one single mysterious threat. But that is not true. Hantavirus is actually a family of viruses. There are more than 40 known species within that family, and that number has continued growing as genetic sequencing technology improved over the decades. These viruses have circulated in rodent populations for many years. Scientists have studied them for over half a century. The name itself comes from the Hantan River in South Korea, where researchers in the 1970s identified one of the original strains while investigating illness patterns among soldiers stationed near the Korean border. And this is where most people completely misunderstand the current headlines. This is not a brand new virus. This is not some unknown emerging pathogen scientists suddenly discovered last week. The medical community has been researching these viruses for decades, so why does it keep showing up in the news? Because the virus never disappeared. It has always existed across North America, Europe, Asia, and South America. What changes is human behavior, human activity, the environments people suddenly expose themselves to. And that leads to one of the most important health questions you should ask anytime alarming headlines appear. Is this pathogen novel? Or already known? Because there is a massive difference. Novel pathogens are dangerous partly because nobody understands them yet. Transmission patterns are unclear. Immune responses are uncertain. Treatment strategies do not exist. That uncertainty creates fear for a reason. SARS-CoV-2 in early 2020 was the perfect example. Nobody knew how it spread. Nobody had baseline immunity. Nobody had a proven treatment framework. That uncertainty created the global crisis. Hantavirus is not in that category. Its transmission routes are documented. Its clinical presentation is understood. Its biological behavior has been studied extensively. And really, that distinction matters because informed caution is very different from blind panic. Now let us talk about how this virus actually spreads, because there is enormous confusion around this right now. A lot of people automatically assume hantavirus spreads the same way COVID-19 spread. Shared indoor air. Sitting near someone infected. Human-to-human respiratory transmission. But that assumption is incorrect. For nearly all strains circulating in North America and most parts of the world, hantavirus is not primarily a person-to-person pathogen. It is rodent-borne. Specifically, the virus exists in the urine, feces, and saliva of infected rodents. In North America, the primary carrier is the deer mouse. In Europe and Asia, different rodent species carry different strains. But here is the truly unsettling part. The waste does not need to be fresh to remain dangerous. That is the detail most people overlook. The droppings dry out over time. They break apart. They become microscopic particles floating invisibly in the air. No smell, no color, no obvious warning sign, nothing your senses can detect. Then someone walks into that enclosed space. A cabin closed all winter, a shed untouched for months, an attic, a barn, a storage unit, a crawl space, a basement rarely used. They move a few boxes around, dust rises into the air, and without realizing it, they inhale the particles. That inhalation is the exposure event. Silent, invisible, completely undetectable in the moment it happens. You feel perfectly normal afterward. You go home, eat dinner, watch television, sleep normally. Your body gives you absolutely no immediate signal anything happened at all. And that is where the quiet window begins. Now, before we continue deeper into the medical side of this, we need to talk about something practical, something immediately actionable. Because if you ever find yourself cleaning an enclosed area with signs of rodent activity, there is a correct sequence to follow. And really, the order matters more than most people realize. If you see droppings, nesting material, gnaw marks, or any indication rodents have occupied that space, stop for a moment before touching anything. First, open every door and window possible. Ventilate the area thoroughly. Then leave it alone for at least 30 minutes before going back inside. Second, wear a properly fitted N95 respirator mask, not a cloth mask, not a simple surgical mask. The particles involved here are microscopic, and an N95 rating is necessary for meaningful filtration. Put on rubber or plastic gloves as well before touching surfaces. Third, prepare a disinfectant solution using 1 part household bleach to 10 parts water. Fourth, soak contaminated surfaces before moving or disturbing anything. Really saturate them. The goal is to neutralize viral particles before they become airborne again. And this next part is critical. Never dry sweep. Never vacuum the area unless the vacuum uses a HEPA filtration system, because the moment you sweep dry droppings or vacuum contaminated debris improperly, you launch those particles directly into the air you are breathing. Finally, double bag contaminated materials. Dispose of gloves and masks afterward. Wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water. That protocol, followed carefully and completely, dramatically lowers exposure risk. It is not complicated. But the sequence matters every single time. Now let us talk about what actually happens inside the body once infection occurs. There are 2 major disease presentations associated with the Hantavirus family, and they affect the body in very different ways. The first is Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, often shortened to HPS. This is the form most commonly seen in North and South America. And honestly, what makes HPS dangerous is how ordinary it looks at first. The early phase resembles influenza almost perfectly. Fatigue, fever, muscle aches, headache, sometimes nausea or dizziness. Symptoms most people would reasonably assume are just a seasonal illness. But then, typically between 3 and 7 days after symptoms begin, the situation changes rapidly. The virus starts damaging the small blood vessels inside the lungs. Fluid begins leaking into lung tissue. Oxygen levels start falling. Breathing becomes difficult. And what makes this terrifying is not just the severity. It is the speed. A person functioning normally yesterday can enter acute respiratory distress within 24 hours once deterioration begins. The fatality rate for hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is approximately 35 to 38%. Pause on that number for a moment. Roughly 1 out of every 3 people who develop the full pulmonary syndrome does not survive. That is not panic. That is medical reality. The second major presentation is hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or HFRS. This form appears more commonly in Europe and Asia. Instead of targeting the lungs, this version attacks the kidneys. It causes severe inflammation of kidney tissue, internal bleeding, and in serious cases, acute kidney failure, requiring dialysis support. Fatality rates vary depending on the strain involved. Some range around 1%, while the more severe Hantan and Dubrava strains can approach 15% mortality. And this is where older adults face very specific vulnerabilities that mainstream coverage almost never discusses properly. If someone already has reduced kidney function, hypertension, diabetes, or chronic kidney disease, their kidneys are beginning from a different baseline compared to a healthy 30-year-old adult. That does not mean infection automatically becomes fatal, but really, it means the margin before the situation turns critical becomes much narrower. The same applies to pulmonary disease. If someone already lives with COPD, cardiovascular disease, sleep apnea, or reduced lung capacity, Falling oxygen levels become dangerous far faster than they would in someone with completely healthy lungs. And I want to be very clear here. This information is not meant to create fear. It is meant to create awareness because, medically speaking, these conditions change one critical factor: the threshold for seeking emergency care. And that brings us directly back to the quiet window problem, because this is what makes hantavirus uniquely deceptive. For most strains, the incubation period ranges from 1 week to 8 weeks after exposure. For the Andes virus, the strain currently linked to the cruise ship outbreak under investigation, the documented incubation period ranges from 4 to 42 days, with most symptoms appearing during the 2nd through 4th week after exposure. Think carefully about what that means. Someone can inhale viral particles during a completely forgettable 5-minute visit inside a dusty garage, and then feel perfectly normal for nearly 2 months. 56 days. Nothing obvious happens. They eat normally, sleep normally, visit family members, exercise, go to routine doctor appointments, completely unaware the virus is already replicating inside the body. And then suddenly symptoms appear, often not gradually, often aggressively. That long, silent delay disconnects exposure from illness in most people's minds. The person who cleaned a shed in March does not automatically connect that event to fever and muscle aches appearing in late April. They assume influenza. They stay home. They wait too long. And sometimes those lost hours become deadly. And this is exactly why awareness matters more than panic. Because with hantavirus, the intervention that changes outcomes is not some miracle antiviral medication. Really, there is no approved antiviral treatment specifically designed for hantavirus infection. What changes survival odds is something much simpler: early escalation to emergency medical care, and equally important, accurate communication with the physician the moment you arrive. If you develop symptoms after any possible rodent exposure, there is a very specific sentence you should say immediately in the emergency room. I was in an enclosed space with signs of rodent activity several weeks ago, and I want hantavirus considered in the differential diagnosis. That statement matters enormously, because it places hantavirus on the clinician's radar early, before respiratory failure advances further. Early oxygen support, careful fluid management, respiratory monitoring, and supportive care are what improve survival chances. And honestly, the critical treatment window is measured in hours, not days. So remember the symptom triad: fever, severe muscle aches, progressively worsening shortness of breath. If those symptoms appear within 1 to 8 weeks after possible rodent exposure, do not wait to see how you feel tomorrow. Move immediately. Now let us talk about the bigger global picture, because this is where people often misunderstand health statistics in dangerous ways. The World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control currently classify the overall population risk from hantavirus as low. And technically, that assessment is accurate, but the important detail is how population risk is calculated. These numbers average exposure likelihood across millions of people: urban residents living in high-rise buildings, people with no rodent exposure history, populations with strong pest control infrastructure. When all of those groups are averaged together, overall population risk appears low. But your individual risk is not determined by averages. It is determined by your actual environment and behavior. If you spend time in rural areas, hunting cabins, farms, older vacation properties, barns, or storage structures, your exposure profile looks completely different from someone living exclusively in climate-controlled city environments. If your work involves older buildings, wildlife, agriculture, soil disturbance, pest control, outdoor labor, or renovation projects, population averages may not represent your reality at all. And really, this is why generalized reassurance can sometimes create false confidence. Low population risk does not automatically equal low personal risk. There is also one important exception worth discussing. The Andes virus strain circulating in parts of South America has shown documented human-to-human transmission in limited cases. That characteristic is extremely unusual for hantaviruses. Nearly every other major strain requires direct rodent exposure for transmission. The Andes strain remains relatively limited in transmission efficiency, but it is precisely why the cruise ship situation under investigation is receiving such close monitoring right now. For viewers in North America and Europe, however, rodent exposure remains the primary transmission pathway. Now, there is another reality sitting underneath all of this that adults over 60 especially need to understand: the aging immune system. Your immune system at 65 is biologically different from the one you had at 35. That is not pessimism. That is physiology. The process is called immunosenescence. Over decades, immune response speed gradually changes. The body becomes somewhat slower at identifying unfamiliar threats, mounting aggressive inflammatory responses, and then regulating that inflammation afterward. And really, this matters because hantavirus places enormous stress on organ systems already carrying reduced physiological reserve in older adults. But there are still factors directly within your control. Sleep is one of the most underestimated immune system tools people ignore. Consistent sleep of 7 or more hours every night is not optional for healthy immune regulation. During sleep, the immune system performs much of its surveillance and repair activity. Chronic sleep deprivation measurably weakens that function. Vitamin D deficiency is another major issue, especially in adults over 60 who spend limited time outdoors. Low vitamin D levels directly impair immune response quality and speed. A 25-hydroxy vitamin D blood test is inexpensive and gives meaningful information about your baseline immune support. Then there is chronic inflammation, elevated blood sugar, excess visceral abdominal fat, sedentary lifestyle patterns. All of these quietly drain immune resources over time. An immune system constantly fighting low-grade inflammation has fewer reserves available when serious infections arrive. And if you are already managing kidney disease, hypertension, diabetes, COPD, or cardiovascular disease, your medical history absolutely matters in how you assess this risk. So let us bring everything together clearly. Hantavirus is not a mysterious new pathogen. It is a known, well-studied virus family. It spreads primarily through inhalation of microscopic particles from dried rodent urine, feces, and saliva inside enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces. The exposure event is silent. No smell, no warning, no immediate symptoms. Then comes the quiet window. 1 week to 8 weeks for most strains. 4 to 42 days specifically for the Andes strain. That silent incubation period is what makes awareness so important. The symptom pattern to remember is simple: fever, major muscle aches, progressive breathing difficulty. If those symptoms appear within 2 months after potential rodent exposure, seek emergency care immediately and explain the exposure history directly. And if you own cabins, sheds, storage units, barns, basements, or older unoccupied structures, assess them now instead of later. Ventilate first, wear proper respiratory protection, wet contaminated surfaces before cleaning, never dry sweep, never aerosolize the particles into the air. Most importantly, stay rational. Fear without understanding helps nobody. But informed awareness absolutely can save lives. And if this information helped you better understand the real risk instead of simply creating anxiety, share it with someone who needs context instead of panic headlines. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us whether you have enclosed spaces around your property that may need inspection after hearing this today. And if you found this useful, like, subscribe, and follow for more medically grounded discussions that actually help people make informed decisions about their health. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.